Everyone loves a good comeback story, right? Whether it's sports, business, entertainment, or maybe even politics. We all love watching people, companies, or teams learn from their setbacks and overcome obstacles to ultimately experience success. It's inspiring, motivating, and just fun to follow. Well, today's podcast is focused on a company trying to do exactly that, make a comeback. The company is called Swivl, and as you'll soon find out, what makes the story so interesting is that their comeback is not quite complete. You can argue that it's just started, so this is kind of like a comeback in the making. Nearly 10 years ago, Swivl launched a successful accessory that they call the Swivl Robot. This led the company to create a new website called Recap, which ultimately was not as successful. And their comeback is a new podcasting platform, Synth. So the question is, will this company, Swivl, be able to take what they've learned from the failure of Recap and ultimately triumph with Synth? Can Swivl complete this comeback? On today's podcast, we'll profile Swivl by taking a deep dive into all three of their associated platforms. 3 separate stories that are all going to converge in one podcast that I hope you enjoy. This one is called The Rise of Swivl, The Fall of Recap, and the Creation of Synth. The story of Swivl begins with Brian Lamb. He's the co-founder of Swivl, headquartered in Menlo Park, California, a city in the San Francisco Bay Area. Originally, he grew up on the East Coast, but Brian relocated to California to pursue a graduate degree in mechanical engineering in what would become the D School at Stanford University. It was there that he'd be introduced to the process of design thinking, which would be essential in the products that you'll soon learn about. While researching potential ideas, Brian and Vlad began exploring the concept of video production.
We were excited about video, and so we had a compass towards creating products for video applications. And it was very early. It was late in flip cameras trajectory, early in GoPro's cameras trajectory, and we knew that there was energy in that space. And so as we started our own ethnographic, observation-based process, we kind of stumbled into a pretty obvious insight, but one nobody had really targeted, which is that people get self-conscious on camera. And if I hold up my flip camera at the time, or now my iPhone, pointed at you and say something smart, usually people go, whoa, whoa, whoa. I don't want to, don't feel natural in that situation. And so based on that insight, we started to go down a process of how do we create a product that addresses that and opens up new applications for video.
It wasn't long before they had the vision of what would become their first and most successful product.
Hi, I'm Brian. And I'm Vlad. And together we call ourselves Satarri.
We both love taking video, but hate being stuck in front of the webcam.
Or having friends do it for you. And since video is getting so good on our phones, we came up with a cool new mobile video accessory that we'd like to share with you.
The audio that you just heard comes from a 2010 video which shared the vision behind their idea, an innovative camera mount called the Satarri Star. It consisted of a small mount where you could insert your phone or iPad that communicated with the wireless receiver, known as the marker, that you could hold in your hand or clip to your shirt. Essentially, the Star would track your movements, making it feel more comfortable and natural to be recorded than, say, if another person was standing there filming you. Brian had built working prototypes for the Satarri Star, but like most startups, he didn't have the capital necessary to mass produce it, and so he eventually turned to a relatively new concept for technology startups back in 2010, the idea of crowdfunding.
There's major kind of trends in venture investment, and at the time we were coming out of the recession and coming on the heels of about a 10-year period where very few, if any, hardware-based companies got any funding to build a business. So we'd seen enough precursors of projects that were kind of like home technology projects that we thought maybe we could give this crowdfunding thing a try.
Brian's crowdfunding campaign on Indiegogo featured a video to introduce their new invention.
Hope you enjoyed the vision. We're 2 product designers that have been working for the last year out of this garage office to bring this idea to you.
The idea is relatively simple. Slip your video phone into our base, grab the marker. If the base can see the marker, it will follow it.
This commercial showed the Satarri Star in action. It followed a child swinging across monkey bars, recorded a woman playing tennis, and even tracked Brian as he ran across the street.
if you look at the campaign we did, it looks very rinky-dink and hokey in retrospect, because at the time that was what the standard was, and we were actually trying to kind of wrap ourselves in the homemaker community segment versus in the professionally produced campaign.
Hokey or not, the campaign was an effective way to introduce the Satarri star. Their fundraising efforts on Indiegogo raised almost $25,000, exceeding their initial goal. It gave them the capital to produce a finished prototype, but reaching their financial goal also served as proof of concept, reassuring everyone, including the company founders, that there was a demand for this device.
For us, what allowed us to do was go to a set of angel investors and say, look, we have people willing to pay us to create this product. It's proof of, some market traction. Will you invest in us? And eventually, through a process of meeting enough angel investors, we were able to use those two things in conjunction to raise enough to launch the first product.
Brian and Vlad would run another successful campaign through Kickstarter before partnering with those angel investors to commercially bring their idea to the public. Eventually, they would change the name of the company from Satarri to Swivl, and the device, known as the Satarri Star, became the Swivl Robot. After the initial funding, Brian was able to unveil a new and improved Swivl in 2012.
We're here to introduce the new Swivl. You can use the new Swivl for telepresence both at home or at work. And with a big display on the iPad, it's a really compelling experience.
But while the new Swivl was improved and available commercially on their website, from a business perspective, things got off to a bit of a tough start. The initial thought was that the Swivl Robot could have mass appeal for everyone. The average consumer could use it for a variety of activities, things like filming their golf swing or cooking or FaceTime chats with family or friends. But based on their initial sales, it was clear that overall, the Swivl Robot just wasn't getting much traction. And so the company tried to find a reason why, and their research led to an important discovery.
We kept getting the steady raindrop of orders coming from schools that we actually hadn't really seen in our crowdfunding campaign, which should make sense because there's just not a lot of schools willing to go spend their annual budgets on a speculative crowdfunding campaign. And so as we were, in this situation of needing to figure out how to market and sell effectively to essentially start to cover the basic costs of the inventory we had bought, whether we could pay our own rents and things like that, it was by necessity we had to go deep and dive into that.
So rather than staying general and trying to market the Swivl Robot to everyone, they instead focused directly on the education market.
And so what we did was we started trying to understand why schools were even ordering it in the first place, because in retrospect, we really didn't have a good handle on that. Connecting with educators, my co-founder and I spent all of our time on customer support calls, trying to get to know people, get to know why they were using the product. And that really started about a 2 or 3 year process for us to really start to master the value propositions of the product within the educational use space.
Dr. Kiosorek and Jim Thompson are educational leaders from Rochester, New York. The two were early adopters of the Swivl Robot, which was an essential part to their instructional video coaching model, and it still is today.
We had this kind of epiphany one day. How cool would it be to use video to complement or supplement the instructional coaching model?
To me, it's not adjunct, it's not tangential, it's central to what we're doing and central to improvement.
In their book titled A Quick Guide to Video Coaching, Dr. Kiosorek and Mr. Thompson share how they incorporated video into their instructional coaching cycle. In their model, teachers record a series of lessons with the Swivl Robot and exchange their thoughts, ideas, and suggestions with a video coach. This ongoing dialogue helps develop a culture of trust and collaboration between both parties. The teacher's self-reflection often leads to more informed and effective instructional practices.
Talk about eurekas and epiphanies. When they first see themselves on video, OMG.com, like, oh my God. Like, I didn't know I talked that much. I asked a student a question, but I interrupted them when they were answering it and completed the answer. I didn't know I was doing all the hard work. I didn't know. And these are veterans, but that video is so important to find the current reality of your practice.
The other cool thing with video and how it changes the paradigm or the dynamic is that the coach isn't in the room. So it's probably the most organic setting of instruction that you have with the camera. So when you put the Swivl in the classroom, you'll get one or two kids that kind of look at it, maybe make a face at it, and then they forget it's there. And so the Swivl is very powerful in the sense that it's really able to capture the most organic state.
So while the filming component of their model could technically be captured by a number of different devices, the unique features of the Swivl Robot and mobile apps make this process user-friendly and more powerful.
We started with, as I mentioned, a camcorder. We were experimenting with different type of boom microphones. So as you can imagine, someone standing there with a big boom because we wanted to capture the interaction, and that's something that can kill your program, is if the technology is not working. It becomes very frustrating. So I'm going to put myself out there, but then the technology fails. Maybe I'm done. I'm going to take my ball and go home. I'm not going to experiment anymore with this new initiative. It really has great audio, great clarity. You're really able to capture quite a bit, better than you would if you had someone walking around with the video camera, because that person may not know what to focus on and when. So this gives you a nice broad capture of instruction.
But as the number of Swivl robots grew in schools, so did the ways that they were being utilized. Sure, administrators and teachers were using them to film lessons for observations or presentations, but in their daily communication with their education customers, Brian discovered a unique use for the device which hadn't been thought of much. The idea of students using the Swivl Robot to record reflections.
There were examples of teachers arranging their students in a circle in the classroom and them handing off the marker, which is the thing that the Swivl follows, and it has a microphone in it, from student to student as they go around the room as a way for students to practice their language. The most driven and motivated teachers would go and edit that video down into clips that they could give to their students and have them reflect on that as a part of how they pronunciated this or what have you. And, they were always really interesting to us, and we saw this happening, but it was always kind of as it relates to like the number of users doing it, a pretty small use case.
Students, not just teachers, using video to record themselves, to answer a specific prompt given by the teacher, to recap their learning. It sounded like a powerful idea, but using the Swivl Robot in this application took a lot of work. It involved capturing, downloading, and then editing those student responses, which was very time-consuming and very challenging. Was there a way to streamline the process so it wasn't so time-intensive for teachers? Brian and his team checked it out.
We went and did some homework on why, what they were trying to do, why it was important, and found it was something that could be very valuable, because using video as a piece of evidence for reflection or feedback wasn't popular at the time, but we knew it could be popular, and B, it needed to get dramatically easier than what we were doing with Swivl. It was all around the workflows of how do you capture clips and share them or keep them private or all these different things. And so that started us down this path of saying, well, what if we created a different piece of software that really made this process of gathering 30 video clips at a time in response to a prompt easy?
It's questions like this that led to the creation of Recap in 2015. Recap was released in a public beta and designed to be a website that would provide students with an easy way to reflect on a prompt, while at the same time providing a new way for teachers to assess student learning.
Okay, class, let's recap.
Recap is a free response and reflection app that lets you see how students learn. It prompts them to capture their thinking on video, making gathering rich insights easy.
That audio was from a 2016 promotional video for Recap. The idea was simple but powerful. Teachers create a question or a prompt, and students film a video response using the camera on their device. After students respond, teachers could then watch those videos and assess their learning. Rachelle Dene Poth is a teacher, author, and educational consultant from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Here's how she remembers Recap and some of the ways that she used it in her classroom.
It was a great tool whenever I started to use it. I've even had students at the time back then say how much more comfortable they felt talking about things as opposed to in the classroom. And then as a result, they ended up feeling more comfortable because they built up their confidence using the video response.
Rachelle was named a Recap Pioneer, one of about 50 or so educators featured on the Recap website to share their innovative uses of the platform. She believed that Recap was very well received by educators like herself. It was practical, easy to use, but more importantly, it helped save time, which was huge for educators.
Recap was so simple to get started with, and I think that is what the draw was for a lot of teachers. Whenever I would have students respond to a prompt, the daily reel would come through and you could just kind of watch the whole, all of the responses, and it was so nice. I thought that was a pretty unique feature.
The reception for Recap seemed to be good, and it appeared that more and more teachers were discovering and sharing the platform. The team at Swivl continued to learn more about their customers and share how Recap was being used in the classroom, both on their website and on social media. Overall, in early 2016, it appeared to be the start of Recap building a growing community around this idea of using video for reflection and assessment. While things looked optimistic for Recap at the time, the series of events that would occur in the coming years would change the trajectory of its success. Okay, so let's recap here. See what I did there? Swivl is the parent company of Recap. The main revenue for Swivl was the sale of the Swivl Robot and subscriptions to the cloud-based services that it worked with. Recap was a product developed by Swivl. It was free for all users and didn't generate any revenue. So the development of Recap was somewhat dependent on the financial stability of Swivl. But around this time in 2016, Brian explains how a period of financial struggles drastically impacted Recap.
In the fall of 2016, Swivl's business had a bit of a blip, I would call it, in terms of our stability and revenues. And we ended up having to pull back on our investment in Recap and go through a layoff, which is a difficult point in time for companies. So it's very, very painful. What ensued for us was 6 months of needing to step back and rebuild our foundations, add back to the team.
Along with the financial issues that Brian just laid out, there was another challenge that Swivl would be faced with during this time. Several years before Swivl started developing Recap, there was another startup out of Minnesota that began working on a similar product. And by 2017, that platform was starting to catch fire. Dr. Charlie Miller and Bradford Hazak had developed a video response platform called Flipgrid at the University of Minnesota. Flipgrid and Recap essentially did the same thing. In early 2015, Flipgrid was able to secure nearly $17 million in funding in just 17 days. This capital provided the company with the resources and the people to continually refine and improve their platform. Flipgrid was also wildly successful at building a huge community of educators who were excited to share how they used the platform on social media. The result was massive organic growth. It was clear that in 2016 and 2017, teachers all around the world had caught Flipgrid fever, a phrase which was coined on social media and then adopted as a marketing slogan by the company.
I would say the winter of 2016, 2017, into the spring of 2017 is when their community really started to explode. Because this was already at a point in time where Flipgrid had raised this massive venture round of $17 million, which also has a lot to do with why they were able to build this large community movement.
Brian's statement about the growth of Flipgrid is no exaggeration. In fall of 2016, Flipgrid announced a 450% year-over-year growth in new teacher accounts. They'd eclipsed this record months later in January of 2017, announcing an 800% year-over-year growth. This type of quick success in a short period of time is not very typical in EdTech, and that's what makes what Flipgrid did during this time so impressive. And as a result, Recap was faced with not only trying to fend off some internal financial issues, but also had the challenge of trying to build a community around student voice at a time when Flipgrid was dominating the conversation.
So what ended up happening was oftentimes their community would I'll try to describe it nicely, but kind of override our community. We would try to hold Twitter chats, but most often it would turn into a Flipgrid fan coming in and talking about Flipgrid and trying to recruit our users over for. There's lots of kind of new ideas and applications we've contributed in our either from our community or just kind of thought leadership on the application of Recap. And it was very often the case that those would get co-opted by the Flipgrid community, but not noted the origin of those things. And I'm describing kind of the basics of it, but if you multiply that by 10,000 people talking very loudly, it gets very difficult to build your own community and some positivity about what you're doing.
The financial issues and Flipgrid fever had limited some of the plans that Brian had for Recap. As a result, the Swivl team did try to add some new features with the Recap 2.0 launch, incorporating the idea of inquiry and questioning through Recap journeys. This was slightly different from the original version of Recap. Teachers like Rachelle found a lot of value in Recap journeys.
You could still ask questions like you had been with the video response, but the difference is that you could create a question for the students and then it could kind of lead them onto their own direction or path and to go through and explore with different websites or things, different steps in the process. It focused more on the curiosity piece and like the inquiry-based, student-driven learning, and gave them kind of this like catalyst to maybe look and explore more on something they were interested in, and it let them kind of work through it in a more natural progression, like, oh, well, I found this now, this is interesting, oh, well, look at this thing, and move on to that different direction.
But while educators likely appreciated the idea behind journeys, many still used Recap as they always have, a simple way to assess student learning through video prompts. While the intentions here were good, Brian considers the whole Recap journeys experience a bit of a misstep.
We tried to elevate the value of that product to involve some more instructional aspects with some formulas we had based on research about how you ignite students' curiosity. I would say those features and those initiatives were less successful, and most often people return to using Recap for that core value that we even started off with.
Internally, it was tough for Recap to compete against the momentum that Flipgrid was building, and Brian and the Swivl team saw this manifest in different ways.
It's just the feeling that that what ideas we have aren't working, or generally speaking, even when you work in a startup, you need positive user feedback and encouragement to feel like you're onto something and that you have enthusiasm to come in every day and have passion for what you do. And when you don't have that, or it feels like somebody else is beating you so badly, it's just very difficult to stay positive. And so it did lead to some turnover in the organization as a result of that, just because it was a challenging experience to be on this end of that.
With Recap struggling, Brian looked into several different possibilities.
We went out and explored how to spin Recap out into its own company to better compete with Flipgrid. And so we went out and tested the idea of raising money, but had a lot of negativity around the idea of just charging a subscription model for what we do. And so the investors we spoke to said, I don't believe you'll ever make a lot of money doing that. And unless you find a different model, I wouldn't invest in this. So the idea of Recap 2.0 was actually in response to all of the feedback we had gotten to try to start to move in a direction of a different kind of business model.
So in 2017, there were a lot of questions for Swivl to consider. Should they stay the course with Recap, keep plugging along to serve the smaller but loyal community that they had built over the past few years? Or was it time to cut their losses and move on, pivot, or maybe Swivl, and move into a different direction? The entire Recap team definitely had a lot to think about. 6 a.m., June 18th, 2018. On this day, thousands of educators would open their Twitter feed to find Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella announce that his company, Microsoft, had purchased Flipgrid. The leading platform for promoting student voice through video now had the backing of one of the largest and most well-known technology companies in the world. Competing against Flipgrid was overwhelming already, and now it was about to get harder. But it never really got to that point. Shortly before this announcement, Brian and Swivl made the decision to move on from Recap. On October 8th, 2018, Brian formally announced the news to the world. Recap was shutting down.
In the fall of 2017, it was already becoming pretty evident to us that we were not going to be able to catch up. The community, just following Twitter followings alone on Flipgrid, they went from something like 7,000 followers in March of 2017 to 25,000 or something like that in the fall. And that kind of user growth within followings on Twitter is pretty massive, right? And we didn't feel like we could compete directly with them. Flipgrid made such a leap ahead. It was something that we weren't able to keep up with at that point in time. And so, there are influences of kind of the business behind what we were doing that impacted what we could deliver to people and why we were going in those directions. And we just weren't able to kind of bring them all to fruition in a clean enough package.
Here's what Rachelle remembers about that news.
I felt really bad because a lot of teachers were used to using that, and I really enjoyed the connections with the team. But based on what I know about Flipgrid and connecting with Microsoft and just that's hard. Like something like that's hard to compete with. But yeah, I was kind of like, oh, really?
In a blog post titled "Recap is Shutting Down," Brian shared some of the reasons behind his decision.
Through an analysis and research, we just decided that for us to have a more positive path and a path that we could handle moving in a new direction with what we had was best.
He openly admitted that Recap 2.0 was a mistake that they could never quite rectify. He also admitted to being completely overwhelmed by the momentum that Flipgrid had built.
So I think in a vacuum, we probably could have continued to reinvest in that product. At the same time, though, that we had that misstep, it coincided with Flipgrid's very massive successes and growth. And those two things together kind of conspired against us being able to resurrect a positive path for Recap. And I think it takes a sophisticated person to understand why, and maybe even some time to understand why things were so different in terms of their community and in terms of ours. They got a few things better than us, and I think they, from all reports, it's a good product and people find value in it. So they earned that positivity, but in terms of our experience, it was something that made it very difficult to persist. And I think it's the last thing I'd say it's worth recognizing is I think the Flipgrid community was a bit of a once in a decade kind of movement. Mm-hmm. And so we just happened to be on the wrong side of what ended up being an incredibly large wave of enthusiasm in the opposite direction.
And just like that, Recap, a platform that seemed so promising 2 years earlier, was finished. But the story, it doesn't end here with the closing of Recap. Because while the Swivl team couldn't resurrect that positive path, they were able to take what did work with Recap and spin it off into a new venture. Around 2018, they mounted the beginning of their comeback. And you'll find out about this comeback coming up next. Once it was decided internally to shut down Recap, Brian and his team spent a lot of time reflecting. The company was down, but definitely not out. Sure, there were some mistakes or missteps with Recap, as well as circumstances beyond their control. There also were some positives. Recap helped popularize the use of video with students. Thousands of videos were recorded on Recap, allowing students to talk more and to develop their voice. And it's that idea of student voice that would become central to their next venture. On October 8th, 2018, the same update that he announced the closing of Recap, Brian introduced Swivl's newest platform. Here's Brian announcing Synth in a 2018 promotional video.
Synth, interactive podcasts in bite-sized increments. Use the orange plus button to capture audio or video synths quickly and easily. From there, you can share and embed synths externally anywhere.
Rather than focusing primarily on student video in the way that Recap did, the concept behind Synth is all about audio, allowing a student or any user to customize their audio experience by recording, listening, and even collecting podcasts in shorter segments known as synths. The concept behind Synth has two main components. First, the idea of inverting the production process through micro-podcasting, basically allowing anyone, even those with no prior training, to record a podcast in seconds.
A student can come in and essentially use Synth as an exit ticket as a first experience and have to do no editing, no other treatment to it other than pressing a button and hitting publish. So it's very, very simple flow with a few buttons. But even within the same tool set, you can start layering on sound effects, or doing multiple synths in a row. And then once you combine those two things together, it starts to sound like you're creating a more traditional podcast. And our goal with the tool sets is we really start to blur the boundary there where you can do some minor editing and sound effects, and it actually could end up sounding exactly like a traditional podcast when you're done with that. but you've done it in this inverted way versus capturing a long file and going through a traditional production experience. You kind of built it up in layers versus starting with something almost analog and breaking it down into what you need.
Users can also upload a longer podcast, which Synth will automatically break down into shorter segments. The initial idea for recording in Synth was actually developed from a little-known feature in Recap, the audio-only response.
What we saw very, very consistently from an early time was camera shyness being a problem for students acting natural and getting the value from sharing their voice. What I always felt like was that the camera confuses the purpose of what you're doing a little bit, because it brings in different emotions than the ones you're trying to foster, which is how to communicate effectively, explain your ideas, things like that. And we actually, even within Recap, did some experiments with audio-only responses as a feature when we saw so many people struggling with this. And you see other people struggling with this in the use of Flipgrid. They'll talk about putting sticky notes and things over cameras. That kind of kicked off the process of, well, what does audio only mean? And that, podcasting is a natural fit when you're talking about an audio only kind of communication.
This is where you see the influence of Recap in Synth. The core of student voice is still there, but rather than only creating video responses, they could now record short audio responses, or synths. Teachers or students can listen to these synths individually or consecutively, like a traditional podcast or audio show.
And we started to mix that insight up with traditional podcasting and looking at ways that we could bring something innovative that blurs the boundaries a little bit between what a traditional podcast is and really what Recap and Flipgrid represent, which is more clip-based development of communication.
The second part of Synth is currently under development and hasn't been released to the public yet. This version is known as Synth 2.0. It's more about finding and discovering content by other podcasters and isolating certain segments.
So say you're a history teacher and you want to use popular podcast content as an instructional element for your students. Today, that's a very difficult thing to do. How do you use Dan Carlin's Hardcore History as a piece of instruction with your 30 students? It's 4 hours long, right? If we can build an experience with a couple different pillars on it, one is we've translated his work into bytes. You as a teacher can grab the 3 or 4 most salient sound bites, arrange them in a private podcast, and then host a classroom discussion around the key points that are shared within that podcast. You really created something that I think takes popular, relevant, engaging content, but brings it into the classroom and helps you really use it in an authentic way. And I think once we get to that point in time, which is really only a couple of months away for us to have all these pieces in place, we've created a connection between the outside world and the education world that I think is a really valuable bond for educators to use in lots of different ways.
What Brian says here is interesting to me because as teachers look to use podcasts in their classroom, it's not always very easy. Let's say you want to share this podcast, EdTech Stories Episode 2, with your students, but you only want to hear 2 or 3 comments from Brian and not the awesome narration that I worked so hard on. It's okay, I understand. But how would you do that? Do you insert the link to Spotify with timestamps for students to skim through? Do you download the audio file, edit your clips with another program, and then upload and share your edited audio file? Neither of these options really sound ideal. But the new version of Synth 2.0 should allow educators to curate segments from a number of different podcasts, isolate the audio that they want, build a collection, and then share that collection with students easily through one link. It would be almost like creating your own podcast mixtape for students. Jeff Bradbury is an educator from New Jersey. He's also the founder of the TeacherCast Network, which offers 9 different educational podcasts. So he knows a thing or two about podcasting.
I remember seeing news about Synth on Twitter, and I was really excited because I'm always looking for different ways that we can bring podcasting or really any audio and video platform into the educational realm, into the classroom.
Jeff is high on the ability for anyone to create a podcast through Synth.
Traditionally, when we look at podcasts, we often start with the questions of how to, what to, and we look at things like equipment and platform. With Synth, we don't have to worry about any of those things. In fact, many times when teachers are using the word podcast, they simply are looking for a way to bring audio and video into their classrooms. They want it simple, they want it quick, and most importantly, they want it for free. all three of those things is where Synth excels.
Jeff reviews a lot of EdTech products for his podcast and website, and he's named Synth the best in class on teachercast.com.
Well, I truly think that Synth is the best audio and video platform out there for teachers. It does so many things right, and it's constantly evolving. First, it gives teachers a free platform for which their students can create small, bite-sized pieces of content, and also a platform from which they can develop and grow a content stream.
This past September, Brian made the announcement that he was moving forward with the launch of Synth 2.0, featuring the ability to search and curate segments from popular podcasts. But rather than releasing it publicly, as he did with the first version of Synth, he announced that it will be shared through a private beta, meaning that it will only be tested by a small group of users, not a public audience. In a blog post, Brian called Synth 2.0 the Pinterest of podcasts, and the tagline was, "Listen with purpose." So it's clear that this new release will focus heavily on content discovery, allowing users to customize and share their listening experience. And this brings us back to the comeback. After closing down Recap 2 years ago, can Swivl complete this comeback with podcasting? It might be some time before we know a definite answer, and Brian explains why.
Even when I'm positive and the response has been positive, it does take a long time to build real traction around things. I've seen lots of people talking about this in other sectors as well as in education. Usually it takes 3 to 4 years for something that is well executed and gets well managed through the early phases to really catch on at scale, right? And it's just because it takes time to pervade people's consciousness for them to understand how it can have value to their lives, even when they see initial promise in it.
The current version of Synth right now isn't generating any revenue, and Swivl as a company will continue to feed fund the venture moving forward. Still, Brian feels pretty good about the initial reception for Synth 1.0 and the plans he has in store for Synth 2.0.
I'd say I'm very positive. I would say it's even slightly better than our experience in first launching Recap. When we first started Recap, of course, the whole idea of what we were doing was foreign. Pretty much nobody had an idea of using video for exit tickets at the time because there was nothing there for it. And so we had to build the enthusiasm and the awareness of what it could do kind of more organically. And in this case, there's now already a developed sense of what voice means and can do in a classroom. And so as we launch these tools, there's much more immediate resonance.
So this is where the podcast does end. But it's definitely not the end of Synth, and certainly not the end of Swivl as a company. In closing, I asked Brian to reflect on this journey that he started 10 years ago. Launching Swivl initially from crowdfunding, creating a promising tool like Recap, which he eventually had to shut down, and now the comeback from that experience with Synth. Here's what he had to say.
This is the way I've digested why Swivl has turned into a business is during the 2000 to 2010 era, there was a push on a national scale to make teaching more accountable. And I think culturally, we extended less trust and respect to educators during that era than was ideal. And what started in 2010 to now has been a more supportive and nurturing investment in teacher skill development and growth. And I think a product like Swivl, certainly was not the cause for that, but played a role in helping create tools and experiences that help teachers feel like they're being supported and getting the feedback they need to continue to grow in their professions.
So the goal, moving forward, is to apply all the experiences and lessons learned over the past decade and design a platform in Synth to give teachers and students new ways to create and listen to podcasts. And because of this, Brian is optimistic for his chances at a comeback.
And I'm very much a growth mindset person. I'm always looking to constantly improve, learn, and adapt. And so I do believe we'll figure out a formula there. Most of the things to be proud of with like Synth, for example, are how we've learned from what we didn't do well with Recap and applied it, and hopefully we'll have some successes with that. So I think kind of where Synth is at is we've gotten through a very positive, particularly within the education community, a very positive first launch. And now comes the hard work of lots of small micro decisions along the way to maintain that enthusiasm, but really grow it to something of meaning and value at a large scale.
So that is the story of Swivl, featuring the Swivl Robot, recap, and now Synth. So today, the team at Swivl, they're still working on this new version of Synth 2.0. But if you want an idea of what it might look like and what it might sound like, you can check it out at synth.audio.